At 14 years old, Mason Sisk was still legally a child, but in the early morning hours of September 2nd, 2019, inside a quiet home in Elkmont, Alabama, he committed an act so extreme that it would force courts, psychologists, and the public to confront one of the most uncomfortable truths in modern crime. Sometimes, the person capable of wiping out an entire family is not an outsider, not a stranger, not even an adult, but a son. That night, 5 people inside the Sisk home were killed. Mason Sisk was the only survivor. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken doors, no masked intruder slipping into the darkness. When deputies arrived, they were immediately struck by how contained the scene was. This wasn't chaos spilling out into the street. This was a family annihilation that ended where it began, inside the walls of a single home. And from the first moments of the investigation, one fact was unavoidable. The only person left alive was a 14-year-old boy. At first, Mason told police a different story. He claimed he had been in the basement playing video games when he heard gunshots. He said he came upstairs, saw his family members injured, and noticed a vehicle pulling away from the home. It was a story designed to point outward, to suggest an unknown attacker had come and gone. Investigators didn't buy it. As detectives went back over timelines, physical evidence, and inconsistencies, they began poking holes in Mason's account. The details didn't line up. The supposed escape didn't make sense. Eventually, after pressure from investigators, Mason admitted the truth. He confessed that there was no fleeing vehicle, no intruder. He had killed all 5 members of his family himself. The victims included his father, his stepmother, and 3 younger siblings. Children who had gone to bed that night, believing they were safe in their own home. What followed was not just a murder case, but a psychological excavation. How does a 14-year-old reach this point? What could possibly push a child toward erasing nearly his entire family? According to reported statements introduced during the case, Mason told investigators he was fed up with the environment inside the home. He referenced constant arguing between his parents and broader family problems. He told investigators that his father would come home drunk every week and that he didn't want his younger siblings to grow up in what he viewed as a toxic environment. This was not framed as a single argument or a sudden explosion of anger, but as something that had been building over time in his mind. That explanation didn't soften the reality for prosecutors. From the state's perspective, the motive mattered less than the outcome. This was a capital murder case involving multiple victims, including children under the age of 14. The legal framework was unforgiving. Regardless of Mason's age, the scale of the crime placed it among the most serious cases the system could handle. Because of that, prosecutors moved to have Mason tried as an adult. The decision sparked immediate outrage and debate. Supporters of juvenile justice reform argued that a 14-year-old brain is not fully developed, that impulse control and long-term reasoning are incomplete, and that life sentences for children represent a moral failure. Others countered with a harsher reality. 5 people were dead, 3 of them children, and the person responsible had planned the killings and carried them out while everyone slept. The case dragged on for years, and at one point, it nearly collapsed. In September 2022, Mason's first trial ended in a mistrial after a major digital evidence issue exploded in the courtroom. Data from his stepmother's cell phone had been newly accessed mid-trial, reportedly after being unlocked with FBI assistance. The sudden availability of this evidence forced the judge to declare a mistrial, delaying justice and reigniting frustration for the victims' families. When the case returned to court in 2023, it came back heavier, darker, and more disturbing. Jurors were shown interrogation footage, including moments where Mason acknowledged he had not been truthful at first. They heard about his post-arrest behavior, including text messages sent from jail to a former girlfriend or friend. In those messages, he floated alternative versions of events, implying he had been forced or that someone else had been involved. In other messages, he veered into disturbing territory, boasting about speed and accuracy, making comments about being a contract assassin, and discussing the killings in ways the prosecutors argued showed a shocking lack of remorse. On April 27, 2023, the jury returned its verdict. Mason Sisk was found guilty of capital murder. Sentencing came months later, on September 7, 2023. Because Mason was a juvenile at the time of the crimes, the death penalty was not on the table. The court had two options: life in prison with the possibility of parole, or life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Chadwick Wise chose the latter. Mason Sisk was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal story didn't end there. Mason appealed his conviction after sentencing, continuing to fight the outcome. In November 2024, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the conviction, upholding both the verdict and the sentence. As of now, that decision stands. Today, Mason Sisk remains incarcerated, having entered prison as a teenager with no release date and no parole eligibility. His case sits at the intersection of every fear society has about youth violence, family annihilation, juvenile offenders, and the terrifying realization that age alone is not a safeguard against extreme cruelty. On February 18, 1988, late into the night, a house in northwest Rochester, Minnesota, became the setting for one of the most infamous teenage parricides in American history. 4 people were killed inside that home: a father, a mother, a sister, a brother, and the person responsible was not a stranger, not a burglar, not an outsider slipping through the dark. It was their 16-year-old son. David Brom lived in that house with his parents, Bernard and Paulette Brom, and his younger siblings, Dan and Richard, known as Rick. From the outside, the family looked ordinary. Nothing about the home suggested it would become a crime scene that would still be debated nearly 4 decades later. But that night, David Brom picked up an axe and used it to kill his entire immediate family. The murders were discovered later on February 18th, when concern grew after David failed to show up at school. What police found inside the Brom home was immediately horrifying. All 4 victims had been attacked with extreme violence. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in, no indication that anyone had come into the house from the outside. The killer had come from within. As investigators worked the scene, another detail stood out quickly. David Brom was nowhere to be found. Instead of being at home or calling for help, he had spent the night at a friend's house. That alone raised red flags. But what truly cracked the case open wasn't forensic science or a dramatic interrogation. It was teenage gossip. Rumors had already started circulating at school that David had told someone he killed his family. Authorities tracked that down, and the story became even darker. A friend later testified that David had described the killings to her and convinced her to skip school with him after the murders. This wasn't a boy in shock. He was functioning, talking, moving on. When police closed in, David didn't present a story about an intruder or an accident. The legal case focused on what he told people afterward and what the physical evidence showed. A blood-stained axe, later identified as the murder weapon, was found in the house. There was no mystery about who did it. The question became why. In the weeks that followed, investigators and prosecutors pieced together the final days inside the Brom household. Reporting in case summaries consistently pointed to an argument between David and his father shortly before the murders. Tension in the home had been building. David was angry, frustrated, resentful. He felt controlled, restricted, and trapped. At trial, the defense did not deny that David had committed the killings. Instead, they argued that he was not guilty by reason of mental illness. His attorneys painted a picture of a deeply troubled teenager suffering from severe psychological issues, claiming that his mental state rendered him incapable of understanding or controlling his actions. The jury rejected that defense. In 1989, David Brom was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing that followed was severe and specific. The judge imposed 3 consecutive life sentences and 1 concurrent life sentence. It was a structure designed to ensure that David Brom would spend decades, potentially his entire life, behind bars. At sentencing, the court acknowledged the tragedy and the presence of mental illness, but still concluded that the scale and brutality of the crime demanded the harshest punishment available under the law. David Brom appealed his conviction. In 1990, the Minnesota Supreme Court upheld it. In 1991, the United States Supreme Court declined to review the case. Legally, it was over. For years, Brom faded into the background of the prison system, his name occasionally resurfacing in discussions about juvenile violence and family annihilation. Under Minnesota's old sentencing rules, his consecutive life terms meant he would not be eligible for release consideration until 2037. Then, the law changed. In 2023, Minnesota enacted sweeping juvenile sentencing reforms, reshaping how long-term sentences imposed on juvenile offenders could be reviewed. Those reforms didn't reopen David Brom's case, but they did alter the timeline that governed it. Suddenly, a name most people hadn't thought about in decades was back in the headlines. In 2025, David Brom was approved for a work-release step-down placement. This was not full freedom, and it was not parole. He was transferred to a Twin Cities halfway house under strict custody conditions. His movements were monitored. GPS tracking was required. Compliance was mandatory. One violation could send him back to prison immediately. Still, the reaction was explosive. For many people, the distinction didn't matter. 4 family members had been murdered with an axe in their own home, and the person responsible was now living in a community-based setting. To critics, it felt like a line had been crossed. To supporters, it was the result of decades of incarceration and a legal system reassessing how it punishes crimes committed by juveniles. His next major review milestone is scheduled for January 2026, when his status will be evaluated again. Nearly 40 years after the murders, the case still refuses to settle, because it asks a question no one agrees on. How much time is enough for someone who erased their entire family before they were old enough to vote? On May 21st, 1998, a 15-year-old freshman walked onto his high school campus in Springfield, Oregon, carrying a small arsenal of weapons. Within minutes, 2 students were dead and 25 others were wounded. It was one of the deadliest school shootings the country had seen at the time. But the massacre at Thurston High School was not the beginning of the story. It was the second act. The first had happened the night before, inside a quiet family home. On May 20th, 1998, Kip Kinkel killed his parents. William and Faith Kinkel were not strangers to concern. For months, their son had been unraveling. Kip struggled with severe mental illness from a young age, including psychosis, paranoia, and violent intrusive thoughts. He was obsessed with weapons, fascinated by bombs, and consumed by the idea of violence. He built pipe bombs. He talked about killing people. He believed others were laughing at him, watching him, plotting against him. His parents knew something was deeply wrong. They took him to doctors. He was evaluated, diagnosed, and prescribed medication. They tried discipline, they tried structure, and when his behavior escalated, they tried to limit his access to weapons. The day of the murders began with a warning that should have stopped everything. On the morning of May 20th, Kip brought a stolen, loaded handgun to school. Authorities were alerted. He was detained, suspended, and sent home pending expulsion. The system touched him, identified the danger, and then released him back into the same environment that had been steadily imploding. That afternoon, Kip returned home angry, humiliated, and fixated. That night, he shot his father once, killing him. He then shot his mother multiple times, killing her as well. He murdered the 2 people who had been trying to stop him, and then he went to bed. Then moved into the interior, 11 years in prison, without the possibility, and headed to school. He brought a rifle, pistols, knives, and more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan wasn't vague. It wasn't impulsive. It was a continuation. He began shooting outside near a breezeway, then moved into the cafeteria as students ran for their lives. 2 teenagers were killed, 25 more were wounded, before classmates tackled him and held him down until police arrived. When officers searched the Kinkel home later that day, they discovered his parents' bodies. In an instant, the narrative changed. This wasn't just a school shooting, it was parricide, followed by mass violence. Kip did not deny responsibility. He pleaded guilty. There was no long courtroom battle over who committed the crimes. The focus shifted entirely to his mental state and how the justice system should respond to a 15-year-old who had murdered 4 people and tried to kill dozens more, then moved into the cafeteria as students ran for them. He suffered from severe psychosis and paranoid schizophrenia, experiencing delusions and command hallucinations that fueled his obsession with violence. He believed killing would bring relief. He believed he was justified. But by pleading guilty, Kip waived an insanity defense. He accepted responsibility for what he had done, even as the court acknowledged the role his mental illness played in the collapse. At sentencing, he apologized and acknowledged his actions, but the damage was already irreversible. Oregon's sentencing laws at the time were unforgiving. Measure 11 mandated minimum sentences for murder. The plea deal established a framework, but the final decision rested with the judge. The judge stacked the sentences. For the 4 murders and the attempted murders of dozens of students, Kip Kinkel was sentenced to approximately 111 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. The sentence was designed to ensure he would never walk free. Years passed, decades. In 2018, Oregon's highest court upheld his sentence, rejecting arguments that his punishment violated evolving standards for juvenile offenders. One justice dissented, underscoring how divided the issue had become. In April 2023, his attorney filed a petition seeking a new type of review, arguing that his youth and rehabilitation warranted reconsideration under modern juvenile sentencing principles. That filing put his name back into headlines, but it did not change his status. There was no ruling that set him free, no decision erasing the sentence. As of today, Kip Kinkel remains incarcerated, serving a sentence without parole. Any future changes hinge on courts, not parole boards, and the lesson embedded in this case remains brutally clear. When a system identifies a dangerous child and sends him home anyway, the consequences can be catastrophic. On the morning of January 25, 2019, deputies arrived at a quiet home in Chulota, Florida, to conduct a welfare check. By the time they stepped inside, it was already too late. 3 members of the same family were dead: a father, a mother, and a son. The killer wasn't missing. He was their other son. The murders had happened the night before, on January 24th. What police walked into that morning wasn't a mystery. It was the aftermath of a slow, obsessive collapse that had been years in the making. Grant Amato was 29 years old, a former registered nurse, intelligent, articulate, and for most of his life, the person his parents believed would succeed. His family supported him financially and emotionally long after adulthood, repeatedly stepping in when he failed to get his life back on track. But behind that support was a secret that was draining the family dry. Grant had become obsessed with a woman he met on an overseas webcam site. Her name was Sylvie. She wasn't his girlfriend. She was a can model. Their interactions were transactional, but in Grant's mind, the relationship was real, personal, important enough to sacrifice everything for. He began sending her money, then more money, then staggering amounts of money. When his own funds ran out, he stole from his family. Prosecutors later laid out the numbers, and they were devastating. Grant stole more than $60,000 from his older brother, Cody. He stole roughly $150,000 from his parents, Chad and Margaret Amato, including money tied to a loan against their home. In a relatively short period of time, he sent more than $200,000 to Sylvie. His family eventually discovered the truth. They confronted him, they cut off the money, they gave him ultimatums. Grant was sent to a treatment facility to address what had become an addiction to online fantasy and deception. For a moment, it looked like the intervention might work. It didn't. After returning home, Grant went right back to the campsite, right back to Sylvie, right back to lying. And when his family made it clear that the money was gone and the support was over, Grant reached the end of the word. On the night of January 24th, Grant Amato armed himself with a missing Jericho 9mm handgun. What happened next wiped out the entire Amato family. Grant killed his father, Chad Amato. He killed his mother, Margaret Amato. And then he killed his older brother, Cody. After the murders, Grant didn't run. He didn't call police. He didn't confess. He staged the scene. Investigators said he tried to make it look like Cody had murdered their parents and then taken his own life. He placed the gun with Cody to sell the illusion of a murder-suicide. He even allegedly used his father's phone to lure Cody home before killing him, setting up the final act of the lie. Then he left. The next day, Grant was located at a hotel. He wasn't hysterical. He wasn't asking about his family. He was taken into investigative detention, and what followed was a long interrogation filled with contradictions and shifting explanations. The story didn't hold. Surveillance footage, financial records, forensic evidence, and digital data dismantled his version of events, piece by piece. Investigators uncovered one of the most disturbing details of all. After killing his family, Grant allegedly accessed online banking using his father's fingerprint and continued interacting with his digital fantasy as if nothing had happened. Prosecutors also introduced evidence showing Grant connected a thumb drive to a computer around 11:30 p.m. on the night of the murders. The drive contained more than 600 photos and videos of Sylvie, including explicit material. At trial, prosecutors framed the motive clearly and relentlessly. Grant Amato didn't kill out of fear. He didn't kill in self-defense. He didn't kill because of abuse or desperation. He killed because his family stood between him and the fantasy life he refused to let go of. The jury heard how his parents had sacrificed financially and emotionally to save him, how his brother had tried to help him recover, and how Grant repaid that loyalty with theft, deception, and eventually murder. The state sought the death penalty, but when it came time to decide Grant's fate, the jury could not unanimously agree on death. That single division sealed the outcome. Grant Amato was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict closed the trial, but it didn't quiet the reaction. The case struck a nerve because it felt uniquely modern. This wasn't driven by drugs or gangs or desperation for survival. It was driven by entitlement, by obsession, by an online fantasy that mattered more to Grant than the people who raised him. In 2021, Grant appealed his conviction. Florida's 5th District Court of Appeal affirmed it. The sentence stood. Today, Grant Amato remains in Florida custody, serving life without parole. No release, no second chance, no redemption arc waiting in the wings. 3 members of the same family are gone because one man chose obsession over reality. On December 10th, 2003, the Whitaker family went out to dinner at a Papado restaurant in Stafford, Texas. It was supposed to be a normal night out, a family meal, nothing more. Less than an hour later, 2 members of that family would be dead. One would be fighting for his life, and the surviving son would be exposed as the mastermind behind it all. Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, known to everyone as Bart, was 23 years old. On the surface, his life looked promising. His parents, Kent and Patricia Whitaker, were supportive and financially stable. His younger brother Kevin was close to him. Bart had spent years telling his family he was succeeding in college and law school, building a narrative of achievement and momentum. It was all a lie. Bart had dropped out. He wasn't graduating. He wasn't progressing. And the lies were about to collapse. In fact, the night of the murders was framed as a celebration. His parents believed Bart was about to graduate. They had even given him a Rolex watch as a graduation gift, a gift for a milestone that didn't exist. Bart knew the truth was about to surface, and instead of confessing, he chose a solution that would permanently erase the problem. He recruited killers. Bart Whitaker conspired with Chris Brashear to carry out the murders. Another man, Stephen Champagne, helped as well. And before this plan was finalized, there was reporting of an earlier, aborted attempt where another acquaintance later told police that Bart had previously asked him to be the shooter. This was not a spontaneous decision. It was a plan. Bart provided the shooters with a key to the house and the alarm code, ensuring they could enter undetected. After dinner, when the family arrived back home, Bart created the setup that would make him look like a victim. As his parents and brother approached the front door, Bart told them he had forgotten his cell phone in his SUV. While they went inside, he stayed back for a moment. Then, inside the house, the attack began. Kevin Whitaker was shot first near the entryway. Patricia Whitaker was shot and killed shortly afterward. Kent Whitaker was shot through the chest and arm. Gravely injured, he collapsed and played dead, listening as his wife and son lay dying nearby. Bart ran into the house and staged a struggle. He was shot in the arm to make it appear that he too had been attacked. When police arrived, Bart was treated as a victim, a surviving son, a young man who had narrowly escaped a home invasion gone wrong. At first, investigators believed him, but the story didn't hold. There were inconsistencies, the lack of forced entry, the precision of the attack, and the fact that Bart's wounds didn't line up with his version of events. As detectives dug deeper, witness statements and evidence began to flip the case entirely. Chris Brashear was arrested. Under pressure, he confessed. He told police everything. Bart Whitaker had planned the murders. He had paid for them. He had given instructions. He had provided access to the home. Brashear was the shooter, but Bart was the architect. To make matters worse, investigators uncovered how Bart tried to clean up the aftermath. A duffel bag filled with evidence, guns, clothing, Bart's cell phone, and other items had been thrown into a lake. Divers later recovered it. Inside, investigators found critical evidence, including a water bottle with Brashear's DNA, tying the conspiracy together. Bart fled the area as suspicion closed in. He was later apprehended in Mexico and brought back to Texas to face charges. When the full picture emerged, the betrayal stunned the public. Bart Whitaker hadn't acted out of abuse. He hadn't grown up in fear. He had been supported, trusted, and believed. Prosecutors argued the motive was greed and self-preservation, an attempt to access his family's estate and avoid being exposed as a fraud. They cited the family's substantial assets, estimating the estate at over $1 million. But even here, the story fractured. Kent Whitaker, the surviving father, publicly rejected the idea that the murders were about money. He insisted it wasn't inheritance that drove his son, but shame, lies, and the inability to face the truth. That tension between prosecution theory and a father's belief would define the rest of the case. Bart Whitaker was charged with capital murder. At trial, the jury heard evidence of the planning, the staged shooting, the fake graduation, and Bart's own words in interviews where he admitted it was his idea. The jury convicted him. Even though Bart never fired a weapon, he was sentenced to death. The contrast was striking. Chris Brashear, the man who pulled the trigger, received life in prison. Stephen Champagne received 15 years. Bart, the son who orchestrated the murders, sat on death row. His appeals failed. In 2009, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his death sentence. Execution dates were set and delayed. Years passed. And through it all, Kent Whitaker did something almost no one could understand. He fought to save his son. Kent publicly opposed Bart's execution. He attended hearings. He wrote letters. He met with officials. He said killing Bart would not bring back Patricia or Kevin, and that executing his remaining son would only add another death to the list. The reaction was explosive. Some saw forgiveness. Others saw denial. Many saw madness. But Kent never backed down. In February 2018, with Bart's execution just hours away, The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted unanimously to recommend commutation. On February 22, 2018, about 40 minutes before Bart was scheduled to die, Texas Governor Greg Abbott commuted his sentence. The death penalty was replaced with life in prison without the possibility of parole. As part of the commutation, Bart Whitaker waived any future parole claims. He would never be released. The decision was based on the totality of circumstances: the father's opposition, the unanimous parole board recommendation, and the fact that the shooter himself had received life, not death. Bart Whitaker was removed from death row and transferred into the Texas prison system, where he remains today. There is no clean ending here, only a question that refuses to go away. What is justice when forgiveness enters the courtroom? In the early hours of April 18, 1991, inside a family home in Montechier di Cresara, a small town in northern Italy, a 19-year-old boy crossed a line so cold and deliberate that it would come to define an entire generation's fear of moral collapse. His name was Pietro Maso. This was not a crime born from abuse. It wasn't self-defense. It was entitlement, raw, impatient, and shared with friends who treated murder like a shortcut. Pietro Maso grew up in a stable, middle-class household. His father, Antonio Maso, was a hard-working man. His mother, Maria Rosa Tesseri, was deeply involved in church and community life. They weren't wealthy elites, but they were comfortable. They owned property. They had savings. They represented exactly what Pietro didn't want to wait for. At 19, Pietro wanted money, status, and freedom immediately. He liked designer clothes, expensive nights out, flashy displays of success he hadn't earned. And as his spending escalated, so did his impatience. Waiting for inheritance wasn't acceptable, so he decided to take it. What makes the Maso case uniquely disturbing is that Pietro didn't act alone, and he didn't act suddenly. Months before the murders, he openly discussed killing his parents with friends. He talked logistics, he talked methods, he talked alibis, and there were earlier attempts. Before April 1991, Pietro explored multiple ways to get his parents out of the way. He looked for someone willing to kill them in the nearby city of Vicenza. He discussed poisoning. At one point, there was even talk of staging an explosion using gas cylinders and a timer, an idea abandoned only because it seemed too complicated. The final plan took shape with a small group of accomplices: Giorgio Carbognian, Paolo Cavazza, and Damiano Barato. They were young men drawn into Pietro's orbit, seduced by promises of money and loyalty. On the night between April 17th and April 18th, 1991, Antonio Maso and Maria Rosa Tessari returned home from a church-related meeting. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Inside the house, the lights were manipulated to create confusion. When Antonio tried to turn them on, nothing happened. In the darkness, the attack began. Antonio Maso was beaten to death with blunt objects, including an iron pipe. His wife, Maria Rosa, was beaten as well, then suffocated. The violence was intimate, prolonged, and carried out by multiple attackers working together in silence. After the murders, Pietro did not collapse in grief. He did not call police. He went out. Pietro and one of his accomplices went to a disco that same night, dancing and socializing to create an alibi. While his parents' bodies lay in their home, he was making sure witnesses would remember seeing him alive, relaxed, and elsewhere. Later, he returned to the scene, not as a son, but as a performer. He alerted neighbors, claiming he had seen his parents' legs lying on the floor. A neighbor entered the house and discovered the bodies, setting off the official investigation. From the outside, Pietro tried to look shocked, but cracks appeared immediately. Investigators noticed his behavior didn't match grief. His focus kept drifting to money, to property, to what would happen next. And when police began questioning his circle of friends, the entire plan collapsed. The accomplices turned on each other. Testimony poured out. Details about the planning, the failed attempts, the promises Pietro had made. The conversations where killing his parents was discussed as casually as changing plans for the weekend. Pietro Maso was arrested and charged with double murder. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Accomplice testimony outlined how Pietro had driven the plan from start to finish, how he recruited help, how he never hesitated, how he treated his parents' lives as obstacles to his lifestyle. The court also examined Pietro's mental state. Psychiatrists concluded that while he was fully aware of what he was doing, he suffered from a partial mental infirmity. It was not enough to absolve him. It did not excuse the crime, but it became part of the legal calculus. In the end, Pietro Maso was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison, the maximum sentence available under Italian law at the time. The public reaction was explosive. 30 years for orchestrating the murder of both parents felt inadequate to many Italians. Editorials raged. The case became a national symbol of moral rot. A son who had everything, wanted more, and chose murder to get it faster. His accomplices received lesser sentences. Giorgio Carbognan and Paolo Cavazza were sentenced to around 26 years. Damiano Barato, a minor at the time, received 13. Behind bars, Pietro Maso remained a polarizing figure. He gave interviews. He spoke about remorse. Some believed him. Many didn't. To critics, his words felt calculated. Another performance, another attempt to manage perception. And then, slowly, the sentence began to shrink. In 2008, Pietro Maso was granted semi-liberty, allowing him to leave prison during the day for work-related activities. Public outrage flared again. In 2013, after sentence reductions and good conduct credits, Pietro Maso was fully released. He walked free. Even after release, his reintegration was rocky. Reports later described periods of psychiatric rehabilitation and attempts at low-profile work, including gardening, but no amount of quiet labor erased the crime. Pietro Maso didn't snap. He didn't lash out. He evaluated his options and decided that killing his parents, with help, was the fastest route to the life he wanted. In 1971, inside a bathroom in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a 13-year-old boy picked up his father's handgun and pulled the trigger. His mother was in the bathtub reading a magazine. She was pregnant. The bullet killed her and the unborn child. His father was shot as well, but survived. When Charlie Brandt turned the gun on his older sister Angela, it malfunctioned. She managed to calm him down and escaped to get help. That single mechanical failure likely saved her life. At the time, authorities struggled to understand what they were looking at. A 13-year-old who had just murdered his own mother without a clear argument, without provocation, without a visible motive. Charlie Brandt was not tried as an adult. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital, evaluated for roughly a year, and subjected to multiple examinations. Doctors never established a clear motive. Eventually, he was released. There was no criminal conviction in the way the public expects. No prison sentence, no permanent supervision. The case faded into the background, filed away as a tragic, unexplainable juvenile act. And for more than 30 years, Charlie Brandt appeared to disappear into normal life. He grew up. He married. He held steady jobs. He moved to Florida. He lived quietly, first in Central Florida, and later in the Florida Keys. Neighbors described him as polite. Co-workers described him as dependable. His marriage appeared stable. No arrests, no known violence, no red flags that anyone could point to later and say, "We should have seen this coming." Until September 12, 2004. That month, Hurricane Ivan forced evacuations in the Florida Keys. Charlie and his wife, Terry Brandt, traveled north and stayed with Terry's niece, Michelle Jones, at her home near the Maitland, Orlando area. It was supposed to be temporary, just a few nights until it was safe to return south. But something changed inside that house. Friends later said Michelle told them not to come over because the Brandts had been drinking and arguing. At some point, Charlie insisted they stay an extra night. Investigators would later say he seemed determined not to leave. On September 15, 2004, police entered the home. Inside, They found Michelle Jones dead. They found Terry Brandt dead. Both women had been killed with kitchen knives taken from the house. The violence was severe and focused. In the garage, they found Charlie Brandt hanging. There was no trial, no interrogation, no confession. Charlie Brandt was dead. At first, it looked like a horrific murder-suicide, a man snapping after a domestic dispute. Then, investigators started digging. When law enforcement uncovered Charlie's juvenile record from Indiana, the entire case cracked open. The 1971 shooting, the dead mother, the unborn child, the father who survived, the sister who escaped because the gun jammed. Suddenly, the Florida crime didn't look like a sudden breakdown. It looked like a continuation. Detectives began re-examining Charlie Brandt's life with a different lens. They searched his home in the Florida Keys and found unsettling material, medical and anatomical references, books and documents focused on the human body, and evidence suggesting a long-standing obsession with anatomy and death. They also found digital traces. Investigators reported that Brandt had searched online for graphic autopsy photographs and disturbing material tied to death investigations. This wasn't curiosity, it was fixation. As authorities widened the scope, they began connecting dots to cold cases that had lingered unresolved for years. One case stood out clearly. In 1989, a woman named Sherry Perichot was murdered near Big Pine Key. Her body had been found with injuries that mirrored aspects of the 2004 crime. For years, the case remained open with no suspect. After Brandt's death, Monroe County investigators re-examined the evidence. They concluded that Charlie Brandt was responsible and officially closed the case, naming him as the killer. That confirmation changed everything. Because if Charlie Brandt killed in 1989, it meant something terrifying. The violence he unleashed as a teenager never stopped. It went underground. Investigators publicly stated they believed Brandt may have been responsible for additional murders as well. They pointed to similarities in wounds and behavior across unsolved cases in Florida. Some detectives went on record describing patterns that suggested experience, control, and escalation. But there were limits. Charlie Brandt was dead. There would be no arrests, no courtroom testimony, no final accounting. What is certain is this: Charlie Brandt was not a man who suddenly snapped in middle age. He was a boy who killed his mother at 13, then vanished into plain sight for decades. The most disturbing part of the case isn't just the murders themselves, it's the gap. More than 30 years where no one flagged him as dangerous, where he passed background checks, held jobs, maintained relationships, lived among neighbors who had no idea who he really was. The system never proved he was cured. It just stopped watching. This was number 2. And the final case takes betrayal to its absolute breaking point, where evidence and loyalty collide in a way that still divides people to this day. On the morning of November 15th, 2004, Pietro Porco didn't show up for work. That was the first alarm bell. Peter worked at the Albany County Courthouse, and when he was late, people noticed. A colleague, someone who knew Peter's routines, went to the Porco home in Delmar, New York to check on him. What they found triggered the kind of emergency call that permanently changes everyone who hears it. Inside the house, something unthinkable had happened to a family that looked completely ordinary from the outside. Pietro Porco had been attacked with an axe. Joan Porco had been attacked with the same weapon. But the part that still makes this case feel unreal, even to people who followed it for years, is what happened after the attack. Pietro Porco didn't die instantly. He was alive for a period afterward. He moved through parts of his morning like a man running on autopilot, starting routine tasks, writing things down, trying to function through catastrophic trauma until he finally collapsed. Joan Porco also moved through parts of her routine, doing ordinary actions that later became a major theme at trial, not because it made the story less serious, but because it showed how the human body can keep moving when the mind is shattered. Peter later died from his injuries. Joan survived, severely injured, and permanently changed. And the person prosecutors said did it was their son, Christopher Porco. From the start, the case was a perfect storm. Family, money, identity, and a mother whose loyalty would become the loudest, most polarizing force in the entire story. Christopher Porco was a college student at the time, and behind the smart kid with a future image was a history of deception that had been closing in. He had been forging documents, he had been lying about success, he had been manipulating finances in ways that put pressure on the family. The prosecution's motive wasn't complicated. Exposure was coming, consequences were coming, and Christopher didn't want his world to collapse. So, he chose the most extreme solution imaginable. A key pillar of the case was Christopher's distinctive yellow Jeep. Prosecutors used surveillance footage, toll and travel timing, and transactions to argue that his Jeep left the University of Rochester area during the night, traveled toward Del Mar, and returned within a narrow window, tight enough to make people argue, but possible enough to convict. That narrow window became the battlefield. The other pillar was the weapon. Testimony described it as a common hardware store axe kept in the garage, an ordinary object that suddenly became the center of one of New York's most infamous family murder trials. When the case finally went to trial, it didn't even happen where most people expected. Because of intense pre-trial publicity in the capital region, and because of Pietro Porco's courthouse connections, the trial was moved out of the Albany area to Orange County in Goshen. The case was already radioactive. Then came the moment that still detonates arguments to this day. Joan Porco defended her son, not quietly, not cautiously, publicly, repeatedly. She insisted Christopher did not attack them, and that single fact, the surviving victim backing the convicted attacker, became the eternal fuel source for debate. But there was another early detail that complicated Joan's later stance. At the scene, police reported that when Joan was asked if Christopher did it, she nodded. Later, Joan said she did not remember that. Supporters of Christopher point to her memory issues and routine behavior as proof she couldn't reliably identify anyone. Supporters of the verdict point to the nod as a raw, immediate signal, before lawyers, before narratives, before years of denial or coping. Either way, it's a brutal human detail. A mother surviving something unimaginable, then becoming the most controversial witness in the case. In 2006, the jury returned its verdict. Christopher Porco was convicted of second-degree murder for the killing of his father and attempted murder for the attack on his mother, and the sentencing structure was as heavy as it gets without being life without parole. He received 25 years to life for the murder and 25 years to life for the attempted murder, stacked consecutively. Minimum 50 years before parole eligibility, effectively caging him for most of his life. That should have ended it. It didn't. Because the Porco case isn't just a case, it's a permanent argument. One side looks at the motive and sees it clearly. A young man buried under fraud and exposure, with pressure closing in, choosing violence as an escape hatch. They look at the yellow Jeep timeline, the travel evidence, the axe from the garage, and the jury's verdict, and they see a completed picture. The other side looks at the same case and can't get past one thing: the mother. They ask how a victim could defend the person convicted of trying to kill her. They ask how circumstantial evidence can outweigh the living witness. They point to the tight travel window and insist it's too tight. They say the case was built on inference. For years, Christopher Porco lost appeal after appeal. Courts upheld the conviction again and again. The verdict stood. But as of early 2026, it's not accurate to call this fully finished. A post-conviction motion, known as a CPL 440 motion, has been actively litigated, and a special prosecutor was assigned due to conflict concerns. That means the legal fight is still alive in the system, still being argued, still moving through court. Christopher Porco remains incarcerated while that process plays out, and Joan Porco's stance remains the emotional center of the case. A mother nearly killed, defending her son even after a jury convicted him of murdering her husband. Christopher Porco sits in prison with a minimum 50-year sentence, and the argument around him may last even longer. From sons who turned greed into murder, to those who erased their own families to protect lies, these cases represent the ultimate betrayal of blood. They weren't outsiders. They weren't strangers. They were the people trusted most, and their crimes permanently shattered the idea that family equals safety. These are the sons who turned against their own, leaving damage that can never fully be undone. If you found this breakdown of these disturbing cases compelling, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments which case shocked you the most.